So hi, I'm Lisa. I'm your TA for U.S. Society, and I am here with Maura Kelly, the Professor of Gender and Sexualities here at Portland State. And so we're going to just ask her a couple questions about the PASCO article that we're reading, as well as some info about what project she's working on and just the different stuff that she does in the PSU Sociology Department and what classes she teaches. So we're just going to start off talking about the PASCO article, and then we're going to go into some of her work. So after reading the PASCO article, we see a lot of different stuff being presented about how our expectations of gender have maybe these unintended consequences on how youths interact with each other, and also how that implicates socialization and future outcomes for these adolescents. So what implications do you think our society's emphasis on hypermasculinity have on gender relations?
I think one of the really interesting things about the PASCO article is the way that it really put masculinity at the center of the analysis. That in thinking about the study of gender and sexualities, there's been a lot of focus on women and femininity, how femininity is problematic for women, trying to live up to these unrealistic ideals. And what this recent turn in the literature and looking more specifically at masculinity reveals is that masculinity is problematic for men too. And I think that the PASCO article is a really great example of the study of masculinity and the ways in which masculinity has negative consequences for individual men. Because this idea of hypermasculinity or hegemonic masculinity involves all of these really unattainable ideals in terms of the ideal body and being able to make a lot of money and be good at sports and lots of different contexts. Lots of different aspects in the context of high school and then in the context of the adult world. But that we see that most men can't live up to those ideals, and that it causes real problems in terms of men's ability to be their authentic selves while trying to live up to these unattainable ideals.
Yeah, and that's really a new approach for gender studies, is because, yeah, they're typically focusing on, well, what is the women's role, how are women being perceived, but we have to understand that it's in two parts. You have to look at both genders and how they interact and how they have expectations of each other, and so I think that that's probably a new aspect that's been coming up in the past few decades that wasn't there before. So what do you think that means for the importance of the subject, of the studying of gender and masculinity? Why is it important for us to study it?
I think it's been a huge contribution to the study of gender. You really can't study gender by just looking at women, right? Men have a gender too. And I think that by studying masculinity, we understand how gender works as a system of social inequality. That it's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about how masculinity disadvantages men, we still have to keep an eye to gender inequality. So the idea that men still, on average, have access to more power and privilege than women. But that power and privilege is not uniformly spread among all men. That many men are disadvantaged by the existing system of gender inequality, as well as women being advantaged and disadvantaged to varying degrees. So in thinking about, rather than thinking about gender being about men versus women, thinking about the diversity of experiences of masculinities and the diversity of experience of femininities leads to a much more rich analysis of gender and gender inequality.
Definitely. So what role would you say that social institutions have in continuing these gendered practices, specifically schools, as we see in the PASCO article?
In the study of gender, we focus on the way in which gender shapes every aspect of our lives, from the very small, from the clothes we put on in the morning, to what room we use to go to the bathroom, and then all the way up to these major social institutions like education and work and the family, religion. But for sure, schools play a really important role in gender socialization, that as kids and teenagers go to school, that's a major place where they learn what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. And what we've seen in the research is that the messages that kids and adolescents are getting is that they're very normative messages about masculinity and femininity, that there's only one way to be a man, there's only one way to be a woman, and that any sort of deviation from that is repressed, is sanctioned.
Yeah, and the messages are coming from not just the students, but the teachers as well. So even the teachers who you think are there to foster, growth of these students are also putting these expectations on the students for their behavior and for their proper use of gender
Mhm.
as well. So I think that
Absolutely.
that's a really interesting component. So how do you think we can change social expectations to conform to gender?
This is always a tricky question, right? When we're talking about something as deeply embedded in our everyday interactions and in our social institutions as something like gender, it's very difficult to challenge, and change happens slowly. But it does happen. That certainly if we think about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what choices we have now compared to 50 years ago or 100 years ago, hugely different, right? From wearing pants to being a professor, right? I mean, there's lots of things I as a woman today can do that, women before me couldn't do. So I think that it's important to not dwell on how hard it is, but rather think about how change can happen. And I think it's important to think about change at the individual level. What can each of us do to challenge gender norms, to think through the ways in which we're being pressured to conform and make little cracks in those molds where we can. But the other piece is that we have to deal with it on a structural level. So we have to think about how is gender inequality part of our labor force? How is it part of our family relations? How is it part of the school system? And really deal with the gender inequality and the ways in which this pressure to conform to masculinity and femininity poses a problem for individuals in these broader institutions.
I agree. So will you tell us a little bit about what projects and what research you're working on currently?
Absolutely. So my main areas of interest are gender and sexuality and work. And so I'm working on a couple different projects. One is a study of apprentices in the highway trades, so laborers, cement masons, folks that are doing the bridge and highway work in Oregon. And the studies that I've done on apprentices have been about why women and people of color are not recruited and retained at the same rates as white men. And it's been a really interesting study. There's lots of inequalities, gender and racial inequalities in the construction workforce. And so my research has been in looking into why that is. Another project that I'm working on with Amy Lubito, your teacher, is about Pride at Work, which is a LGBT labor organization. So it's a study of the activism that occurs at the intersection of labor politics and LGBT politics, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender issues. And so it's about looking at sexual inequalities in the labor force. And then the last project that I'm currently working on is I recently completed doing interviews with LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer workers in the Portland area. And so I talked to people that did all sorts of jobs about their experiences at work with discrimination, why they chose the jobs they did, whether or not they were out at work, and other topics related to work and work-family balance.
So will you tell us a little bit about what classes you teach at Portland State, and maybe just say what class is your favorite and why?
So I teach a class called Gender and Sexualities, and that's my favorite class to teach. It's really interesting. It's an introductory level class. There's no prerequisites. You don't have to know anything about gender or anything about sociology to take it. And we really explore a lot of the things we've been talking about today. Sort of how does gender and sexuality function in our everyday lives, in our personal lives, in our interactions, and in our social institutions. I also teach a class called Sociology of Gender that looks at some of the same topics at a little bit more of an advanced level. It's a 400 level class. And I teach a class on gender and work, again, my area of expertise. And again, we're looking at some of the empirical research that's being done in the area of gender and work.
Well, I've taken her class and I highly recommend her. It's really good, interesting stuff, and you definitely get to read a lot of interesting articles and do cool projects. So I definitely recommend you take your class. Anyways, thanks all for listening. Hope you enjoyed our little video and were able to relate it to some of the stuff you read in the Pasco article. So thanks. Bye.
Thank you.